The first thing to note is that Return to Salem's Lot is only a loose sequel to Salem's Lot. It's completely irrelevant. At best, there is the name of the town, and the same basic storyline of an outsider arriving to find the town overrun by vampires. In fact, Larry Cohen has completely abandoned the book/miniseries continuity. Stephen King and Tobe Hooper witness a modern-day town suddenly invaded by a lone vampire whose bite spreads an infection to the town's humans. Cohen had already inhabited the city with vampires since the arrival of the Mayflower. Rather than making a sequel, Larry Cohen seems to have viewed Salem's Lot as a loose text to which he could freely associate his own ideas. Note that the film's video cover prominently features an image of Barlow, the vampire from the TV miniseries. However, this character, or anything like it, does not appear in the film. Larry Cohen's films are noted for their uniquely thoughtful sympathy for monsters and Cohen's signature wry sense of humor and sarcastic characterization. Cohen's interesting idea in Return to Salem's Lot is that vampires are not the chaotic and carnal elements that threaten to tear society apart, as they have been since Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, but rather it's about being a polite conservative trying to maintain the status quo in society. Their society is sometimes no different than a New England country club. They are not trying to consume the world, they are simply trying to convince humanity that they are normal. On the downside, Larry Cohen seems to have more fun experimenting with outlandish ideas than developing scripts. Return to Salem's Lot was shot in quick succession with another Cohen film, It's Alive 3, The Island of the Living, 1987, but it was a chaotic flood of ideas and haste, showing signs of the shooting schedule. Both films look cheesy and rushed. Larry Cohen doesn't do a good job of directing, apparently because of the production rush. His other film, It's Alive, is more tense, but the attack scenes here feel choppy. The only exception is the rather suspenseful scene where Sam Fuller gets caught in a bear trap at the bottom of the stairs to the basement just as the vampires are trying to get out of their coffins. You can see his 1979 TV movie/adaptation Salem's Lot by Tobe Hooper, Stephen King and screenwriter Paul Monash features the most terrifying depiction of a vampire ever seen on screen. Is a widely respected, almost masterpiece. Unfortunately, 1987's belated sequel is a gruesome farce with no horror overall. It's an anarchic movie blob packed with silly acting, amateurish plotting, pantomime and pound shop effects. The grisly horror of the original is absent in the sequel. The former cast and characters aren't returning either, but a seemingly Nosferatu-esque Mr. Barlow, Reggie Nalder, appears on the cover of the movie, sporting wings like a horned dove in a classic vampire bat pose. There is still, Return to Salem's Lot is disorienting and at times funny and lively, thanks to Larry Cohen's exuberant gore blasts and playful direction. Paired with Michael Moriarty's compelling lead role, the film is bearable. Inappropriate, strangely hypnotic, and colorful in the opening sequence, chunks of molten lava dance across the screen like lamps before merging with fire. Jo reluctantly takes Jeremy to Salem's Lot for her father-son bond and some R&R. After that, the two move to the house of their late aunt. After a few scenes of J&J swearing at each other and smoking cigarettes, a major feud with Salem's secret vampire community began, quickly leading to bloodshed and other crazy happenings associated with the town. Be connected. Here is a brief movie synopsis. Movie director Joe Weber is urgently recalled by Amazon only to find that his ex-wife has given up custody of his son Jeremy. Joe decides to take Jeremy to the house he inherited from his aunt in the small town of Jerusalem's Lot, Maine. After moving in, they learn that the town is inhabited by vampires. Joe befriends the mayor, Judge Axel. Axel explains how vampires came to America in the days of the Pilgrims and chose to live in hiding here. He now wants Joe to write her story. Now for the review. When a self-righteous, absent-minded father, Michael Moriarty, considers himself to be a heart of gold, his precocious son is suddenly confronted by a high-society mother. Think that would be a good thing. He considered taking him back to Salem's Lot, the town where he grew up. The dialogue between father and son is quick and snappy at first, which is what makes it appealing, but as the story progresses, Moriarty's performance becomes dull and the son becomes a well-worn stereotype. Arriving at the Salem estate, they attempt to renovate the house that once belonged to their aunt, but soon find that the entire town has been overrun by vampires. Rather than running for their lives, father and son spend time while the resident vampires try to convince them that their lifestyle is beneficial and that they should join them. The vampires want Joe's father to write a Bible about their life and culture, but they take advantage of his son. Return to Salem's Lot is so far removed from its predecessor that its premise would have been better developed as a standalone film. No characters or events from Part 1 are mentioned, so only the name of the town and the name of the vampire are carried over from the original. The story had the potential to blossom, but was held back by Salem's lip service to Lot, who completely ignored many elements of the first part. Directed by Lucio Fulci, Zombie 2 was released under that name following the success of Dawn of the Dead, which was called Zombie in Europe, but is a standalone film. This sequel was no different, being a stronger film in its own right and eschewing Salem's Lot lore. This sequel, labeled, did more harm than this film deserved. Return to Salem's Lot is incredibly poor in storytelling, supporting characters, character development, and effective horror itself, but is still lovable due to its inherently clumsy presentation and design. There is, for this reason, the movie is rarely as gruesome or haunted as many horror sequels. Cohen's frenzy takes the form of the overly anarchic characters and gestures that grace his other films. The Staff, Ambulance, and Evil Stepmother. But his style is sometimes inappropriate when applied to what should be a creepy vampire movie. I Can Feel It. Evoke fear. This change in tone feels more like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 compared to the first game. But while the lighter comic style worked in part for Chainsaw 2, suspense, scenes and drama are here handled with flunky finesse by Cohen, sadly resulting in a lack of atmosphere and no frights whatsoever. Bloodsuckers surface almost immediately after Joe and Jeremy's arrival and not in a mysterious, shadowy manner. Rubber-masked vamps attack a car of punk kids passing through while child bloodsuckers maul a couple of drunks by a forest campfire. Death, blood jets and an amusing lakeside rock bludgeoning unfurl awkwardly along with a wafer-thin plot. The supporting cast, including Tara Reid in her screen debut, are mostly by-the-numbers bar Cohen muse Moriarty, who has appeared in several of the director's features including Question the Winged Serpent, The Stuff and his Masters of Horror episode Pick Me Up. Moriarty's characters in Cohen films are all abhorrent schmucks but with lovable nuances and are refreshingly unconventional protagonists, illustrated in the movie when Joe is seen punching a colleague and hurling abuse at his son. Joe encounters a secret society of vampires led by Chief Justice Axel Vamp and is asked by Quango to write the Vampire Bible. Act 3 introduces Drive Van Helsing-esque Nazi hunter Van Meer, played by filmmaker Samuel Fuller, who comes to town, but is enlightened by Joe and reveals the identity of the man Van Meer is looking for. Then Joe and Van Meer embark on a midday stake-off, pitting the two against a bride who lives in the basement and severs her carotid artery. It's a quest for a satisfying finale, breaking down the coffin and impaling the vampire's heart with a spiked piece of wood. The most interesting thing about the film is that the enigmatic old Van Meer shows up looking for his missing friend, but who happens to know more about Salem's Lot than he reveals. It may be a little inconsistent, but the film still contains quite a bit of entertainment beyond just a handful of supporting characters. This should not be taken too seriously. As long as you don't assume this is a sequel, you can have a good time here. The pace starts to lose energy towards the end, just as runners pull off the last of their strength to finish the race. The effort was sloppy, and though not beautiful, this runner crossed the finish line. Here is a complete description of the plot. South American anthropologist Joe Weber is ordered back to the United States by his ex-wife Sally. Sally threatens to send her son Jeremy to a psychiatric hospital if Joe doesn't comply. Do not intervene. Joe decides to take custody of Jeremy and return to his hometown of Salem's Lot, Maine. There he owns an abandoned, dilapidated farmhouse he inherited from his late Aunt Clara. Unknown to Joe, Salem's Lot is actually a colony of vampires. One night, a group of teens were stopped by a police officer who, along with other townspeople, began eating them. One of the teenage girls, Sherry, manages to hide in a church before fleeing to the outskirts of town and wandering into Joe and Jeremy's house. Joe takes Shelley to a meeting with the mayor, Judge Axel, to report the incident. Indoors, Joe, Sherry, and Jeremy are welcomed to a dinner attended by various members of high society, including Amanda Fenton, the town doctor's young granddaughter. At her grandmother's urging, Amanda takes Jeremy on a tour of the city while the adults gather. Sherry becomes hysterical when she notices one of the attackers at the gathering and is taken to another room to meet the vampires for the last time. To Joe's shock, Judge Axel reveals himself and the townspeople to be vampires. Axel tries to appeal to Joe's objective anthropological methodologies in the hope that he will be able to raise the profile of Joe in the community and eventually write religious texts to the people. While on tour, Joe encounters his Aunt Clara, who he thought had passed away years ago. She is also her vampire and indulges in her thoughts about her own drinking problem. Joe, confused by what he's learned, decides to stay in Salem's lot and renovate his family home. At a late-night class reunion, Jeremy and Joe learn that the townspeople are breeding drones, humans safely exposed to sunlight to monitor the area's daily operations in order to maintain surface normalcy. Know What You Are Doing. The principal also explains the origins of vampires and how they crossed into the United States at the same time as the Pilgrims. Joe soon rekindles his romance with Kathy, also a vampire, with whom he had a teenage affair. Jeremy Joe, meanwhile, admits that he intends to become a vampire and live in the community forever. When Jeremy becomes sensitive to sunlight and becomes ill, Joe realizes his transformation has already begun. When Joe tries to escape with Jeremy, he is attacked in the river by two local drones, one of which is crushed by stones, after which he loses consciousness. Joe awakens from the Axel family raid, where Aunt Clara and Kathy reveal that Kathy is pregnant with Joe's child. They also inform him that Jeremy will be reborn soon. Shortly after, Joe meets Van Meer, an eccentric Nazi hunter patrolling the town. Joe and Van Meer join forces in hopes of saving Jeremy from the vampire's influence. After laying siege to the townspeople and burning down their homes with Van Meer, Joe and Jeremy confront Axel, who reveals himself as a true grotesque vampire. A fight breaks out in the barn and ends with Axel being impaled with an American flag. Van Meer steals a school bus and rescues Joe and Jeremy. Now here are some final thoughts and evaluations. A very interesting premise lies at the heart of Return to Salem's Lot, in which we see the vampire community trying to justify itself and create history. Increase. Salem's Lot may be something of America's new town trying to assert its own identity, but with fangs. There have also been attempts to tell the classic Stephen King story without him. Its only credit is based on character from, but its influence is far-reaching, even if it wasn't of its usual quality. The plot itself is typical of King, a troubled family trying to start their lives over in Maine. Joe is a professional observer, an anthropologist here rather than a conventional writer, with this small town succumbing to evil and the battle to do the right thing or succumb to dark temptations. So, while it's a real shame that A Return to Salem's Lot is a bit lousy, it's not without a certain charm. When he is first introduced to Larry Cohen regular Michael Moriarty, his rather odd acting is assumed to be part of his character's professionalism and clinical demeanor. His astounding rhetoric seems to be his approach to the character, making Joe a strangely deadpan albeit mildly manic figure. And Ricky Addison Reed as the annoying Jeremy, Joe's son, bursts into the movie like cheesy Corey Haim, roaring at every scene. This is probably a response to Moriarty's constant tone of surprise. It's not entirely Reed's fault. Annoying Jeremy is written as a caricature of youthful rebellion, laced with shady haircuts and terrible fashion sense. As a combination, Weber does not constitute a likable character. No performance is as great as James Mason, but performances elsewhere span the fluffy end of the spectrum. June Havoc takes on the challenge as Joe's Aunt Clara, and watch out for young Tara Reid, who plagues Jeremy's long-toothed angel. Van Meer's arrival is one of the many random changes in tone that occur throughout the storyline, making it difficult to tell if it's meant to be funny or scary. It seems to be attributed to a script that never quite decides. Some attempts at black humor are more effective than others. Aunt Clara sarcastically states that it's a drinking problem, that she prefers human blood, and she has a well-deserved laugh with her very creepy little old lady tone. There's also a great gag when Joe and annoying Jeremy go to school. But much of the humor is of the delightfully unintentional kind that provokes laughter mixed with joy and disbelief. The first thing that made me laugh unintentionally was the appearance of the master vampire. His prosthetic body makes him look like Aiko from Nosferatu and a bucket of steroids. Another classic is Joe's tour of the vampire population. This tour takes you through a town farm that uses cows instead of humans for blood production. Moriarty's appearance suggests that Joe is getting a little bored with the vampire's capricious food supply, but then he shouts a very classic phrase. "I've seen enough cows. I miss my son." Return to Salem. Lot pales in comparison to its predecessor, but its choppy editing, Cohen's oddly static rendition, and unexpected shifts in tone make it forgettable. It should be an unforgettable experience. This is a fun watch for all the reasons it shouldn't be, and although any attempt to recreate the King without key ingredients fails completely, I can't help but admire the effort. Scariest moment. There's a really good jumping scare when annoying Jeremy is exploring the school in the daytime when a bearded man appears on the stairs and asks what he's doing there. Prostheses aside, this is very disturbing. Menard's score can get a little soapy in the quieter moments, but once it kicks in, it contains a great Carpenter-style theme. King's one thing about him. In this week's section, we'll be looking at how not to make Stephen King a hero. Joe Weber makes such a bad first impression as a character that even King's anti-heroes like Jack Torrance in the books manage to avoid it. He's an unlikable character, but Moriarty gives him a personality like the piece of wood we saw in the middle of the movie.